Mr. Speaker, I thank you for accepting my request this afternoon for permission to raise an urgent matter of public importance for which the Premier and his government have responsibility, and to elicit a response from a member of the government responsible for the matter. Mr. Speaker, the onset of the COVID pandemic of 2020 has wreaked havoc on world economies, decimating many countries. 2.5 years later, the world continues to grapple with the pandemic and the economic fallout from it. In the Cayman Islands, we have seen severe impacts on our economy, with the closure of our borders to tourism for many months. Collateral fallout from the pandemic has evidenced itself in the form of significant disruption to the supply chains for all sorts of raw materials and finished goods, making it harder and more expensive for economies to function efficiently and effectively, including our own. Now, for the past 3 months and continuing, the world is contending with the war in Ukraine and the impending shortages in food, particularly grain and other raw materials, further adding to the misery. I might add today, Mr. Speaker, that the World Health Organization is warning now of serious food shortages as a result of what's taking place. The result is that all these disruptions and shortages are driving prices higher in literally every sphere of economic activity. In the United States, where the annual inflation is reported to have been 7.04% in 2021 and running at an annual rate of 8.26% through the end of April 2022, it has resulted in the Federal Reserve embarking on an aggressive course of raising interest rates in an effort to curb consumer demand and bring inflation under control. Mr. Speaker, it is worth noting that the rates of inflation that the U.S. and indeed the Cayman Islands are experiencing are the highest seen in more than 40 years. You've got to go back to the late 1970s and early 1980s to find a time when inflation was this high. Here in Cayman, nowhere is the rampant inflation more evident than at the grocery stores and at the gas pump, where prices for gasoline topped $7 per gallon last week for the first time in our history and are likely to go substantially higher. It is not unheard of for motorists to now pay more than $100 to fill up a car these days. In response to the Federal Reserve's actions, local banks are also raising their interest rates for all forms of lending, making it more expensive for Caymanians to borrow, and in almost all cases, extending the life of home mortgages as more of borrowers' monthly payments are going to pay interest rather than principal. Mr. Speaker, what really brought this to a head for me was the release yesterday of the ESO's Consumer Price Index report, January to March 2022, and the Premier's remarks made yesterday also at the RF Economic Outlook Conference. Mr. Speaker, the ESO reported that the Consumer Price Index increased by 11.2% in the first quarter of 2022, when compared to the same period in 2021. And for the first time that I can recall, every division in the CPI basket showed increases in average prices. Mr. Speaker, I think it bears repeating, because my colleague did mention it in his contribution in the private member's motion that we just debated. But it also bears repeating, and I will read them briefly here. The increases: housing and utilities, the division has shown a 20.1% increase, as the cost of electricity had a 35% increase. Transportation, index for this division has increased by 15.7%. Clothing and footwear, the division showed an 8% increase as the cost of footwear and clothing purchased abroad rose by 28% and 3.8% respectively. Furnishings and household equipment and routine household maintenance 7.2% increase in the division's index, traced mainly to household textiles, showing a 34.1% increase. Food and non-alcoholic beverages, the division showed a 4.9% increase in the average prices of meat and products, and fruit rose by 13.8% and 11.9%. Restaurants and hotels, the index for this division recorded a 4.3% increase. Communication showed a 3.7% increase as the cost of telephone and telefax services rose by 5%. Miscellaneous goods and services up by 2.1%. Alcohol and beverages up by 2.1%. Recreation and culture up by 2%. Education up by 1.2%. And health, an overall increase of 0.2%, being the lowest division in the basket to show increases. But Mr. Speaker, all of them showing, with that one exception, showing fairly substantial increases. And Mr. Speaker, economists are telling us that inflation is not going away anytime soon. While predictions vary, it seems clear that it is unlikely that there will be any meaningful relief before the end of 2022 and possibly well into 2023. Warning bells that the U.S. economy is likely to go into recession next year are ringing louder and louder and becoming more frequent. And stagflation, first time I'm hearing this in many decades, which is high inflation with low or no growth, is a growing concern. And that is a disaster for any economy. Mr. Speaker, all these things are having a very serious impact on Caymanians, who have found out very quickly that their hard-earned dollars simply do not buy what they could last year. And they are struggling to cope with the reduced purchasing power of their dollars. Higher prices for groceries, utilities, housing, transportation, and clothing, all things that we consider essential to our well-being in Cayman, are the areas where the ESO report indicates the highest inflationary impacts. Our people are in a crisis. Some of those, Mr. Speaker, who are hit the hardest by rising prices of essential items are our pensioners on fixed incomes with little to no ability to earn additional income, and are therefore largely affected by the reduction in the purchasing power of their dollar. They are hurting especially hard, and many are already starting and having to make decisions about whether to buy necessary medicines or the same types and quantities of food that they are accustomed to. Mr. Speaker, throughout these challenges, we have yet to hear from the government on what their thinking is, let alone what their plans are. I came to this meeting of Parliament with the full expectation that the Premier would deliver a statement to this honourable Parliament on this matter. I am disappointed that the Premier has not found it fit to do so. Mr. Speaker, as I sat here today preparing and thinking about what could Cayman do, I identified a number of things that the government could consider in terms of ways and means in which we could give help and render assistance to our people to help them through. Mr. Speaker, I'll just take a few minutes to share these with you. These are my personal views, and I do this from my experience and time there as former Minister of Finance, and also coming out of my background as well in financial services for all of my working life. But Mr. Speaker, if whatever government is considering, I would suggest that they look at doing things that will be helpful to all citizens. Most importantly, it is most important that everyone benefits from whatever you intend to do in terms of giving assistance to the public. Things that you might consider are a reduction in the duties on gasoline and diesel, even if it is only for a short time period, so at least at the end of the year. and then see where we get to. Is inflation coming down? Is the economy continuing to expand? Evaluate it as you go along. So let's suggest that we reduce duties on gasoline and diesel through to the end of the year. I would highly recommend that they defer the reinstatement of pension contributions scheduled to come in at the end of June and extend it now to the end of December. Every working person benefits from that. Every family, every person will benefit from a reduction in gasoline and diesel if we reduce the taxes. Then I would urge that you consider increases in the stipends paid to seamen, veterans, and those who are totally dependent on financial assistance from government. Fourth, I would urge you to consider, if it isn't already happening, I would urge you to consider a COLA for all the public service. If those talks aren't happening, they certainly are going to come. I repeat it at the insistence of my colleague, consider a COLA for all the public service. Fifth, consider a continuation of the COVID stipends. Mr. Speaker, I'm not suggesting that every one of these suggestions can be implemented or accepted. I give them and I offer them to the government as examples of what could be done. And I hope that they will give them due consideration. Mr. Speaker, I'm determined not to let this session of Parliament end without hearing from the Premier or some other member of the government on this matter. And so, Mr. Speaker, I do conclude my presentation this evening, and I ask the question, Premier, please tell us what your government's thoughts and plans are to provide meaningful relief from the rampant inflation and associated high cost of living that Caymanians are continuing to experience. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker.